Hi, I'm Emily Momberger, and I'll be sharing about applied behavioral analysis today. So here's what we're going over, and I wanted to start the background by going over historical foundations in terms of the psychologists and theories that were influential in applied behavioral analysis, or ABA. So we know Pavlov and his research into classical conditioning, or when behaviors are learned by connecting a neutral stimulus with a positive one. And B.F. Skinner actually coined the term radical behaviorism as he theorized that the consequences following a response were more important to enact behavioral change, which was a change from Pavlov's classical conditioning theory. Paul R. Fueller's 1949 article, Operant Conditioning of a Vegetative Human Organism, reported increasing the arm movement of a comatose patient through positive reinforcement. And Dr. Sid Bijou, who had actually worked with B.F. Skinner for a couple years, published several landmark studies in the mid-1950s in which his team applied operant conditioning to children instead of animals. Dr. Bijou's research led to uncovering numerous methods for managing behavioral problems, and he conducted research in natural settings, such as the student's home or school. This research heavily influenced Dr. Ivar Lovaas, who is known as the father or pioneer of applied behavioral analysis. The main theories that ABA is based on is behaviorism, or the theory that human behavior can be explained in terms of conditioning without consideration of internal events like thoughts or feelings, and operant conditioning, which we just described, being that human behaviors is based on the immediate consequences. So, like I said, Dr. Ivar Lovaas is the pioneer of applied behavioral analysis. He was born in 1927 in Norway, and something I thought was interesting about his childhood is he actually attended school for 5 years under the Nazi regime until 1945. Later in life, he cited this time as the primary reason for studying psychology because he wondered whether such destructive behavior from the Nazis originated in nature or nurture. Shortly after graduating high school in 1948, he was accepted on a violin scholarship to Luther College in Decorah, Iowa. He graduated with a bachelor's degree in sociology and immediately started training as a clinical psychologist at the University of Washington, where he also received his PhD. In 1961, he joined the UCLA psychology department as assistant professor, which is where he stayed for the next 30 years to conduct most of his research. So Dr. Lovaas's contributions to ABA were immeasurable. It is important to note that the time period in which his research occurred, many institutions and psychologists still worked under the assumption of Freudian theories, which suggested the unconscious memories, thoughts, and urges is what influences behavior. Dr. Lovaas introduced behavior modification, which bases scientific decisions solely on empirical evaluations and reliable data. So the theories he used in his research, such as the operant conditioning method, weren't new, but his application of these theories on children with disabilities in natural environments and then maintaining that data collection was new. Another major contribution was the early intensive behavioral intervention, which was formed, this idea was formed from a publication of three major research publications. So it was the 1973, 87, and 93 study. In 1973, Dr. Lovaas started the UCLA Clinic for the Behavioral Treatment of Children to test specific language interventions on various age groups. Most research consisted of children with autism or other developmental delays. And he found a significant difference in the number of gains in language between the younger children, like early childhood, and then that of later in adolescence. The 1987 study, Dr. Lovaas studied three groups with various levels of intensive support. So the children would receive either 0 to 40 hours of intensive individualized support each week for the different durations. And he found that consistent intervention for longer durations significantly impacted whether children would maintain or lose those gains. In the 1993 study, Dr. Lovaas revisited the children from previous studies to determine the long-term impacts of the intensive intervention. Based on the findings from all three studies is how he created the central elements of early intensive behavioral intervention. He was also the first researcher to study children with autism, including nonverbal children, and determined that they should remain at home with their parents instead of institutions because they could successfully attend school in a general education classroom based on his studies. And then lastly, for most of his research, Dr. Lavasse worked with children who did engage in severe self-harm, and he was able to modify their behavior with positive reinforcement. However, sometimes his team would use negative reinforcement to stop dangerously harmful behaviors so that they could continue using positive reinforcement. This quote at the bottom that I had felt intense fear and guilt as to what I had done refers back to the times that he did have to use negative reinforcement because he believed that it was a last resort to use only sparingly. So getting into applied behavioral analysis and its key concepts. Applied behavioral analysis is one of 3 branches of the discipline of behavioral analysis, which, like I said, follows the guiding philosophy of behaviorism and operant conditioning. Behaviors do not study how internal events like thoughts or feelings influence behavior instead, they study the events immediately leading up to, during, and after the behavior. An applied part of applied behavioral analysis means the study of socially significant behaviors. And a socially significant behavior is a behavior that's important to the individual, family, or community to change, such as hitting every single time someone is frustrated. They would want to change that behavior to using a sign or verbalizing if you're able. ABA is a scientific approach to understanding that behavior relies on evidence-based practices and reliable data obtained in natural environment so behaviorists can accurately determine the triggers and consequences for that behavior. And applied behavioral analysis is most notably known as an effective practice with autism spectrum disorder, but it actually is used in a wide variety of subcategories such as health and fitness, substance use disorders, or just any individual trying to change their behavior. Here are the main principles of behavior that serve as the basic assumptions for all strategies used in ABA. As you can see, they're closely aligned with the theory of operant conditioning, and you can just read those there. I won't go over all of them. So understanding why a behavior occurs through the lens of ABA, we must first consider the consequences of the behavior. Listed here are the 4 rewards that students usually earn that increase the possibility of an unfavorable behavior reoccurring. So for example, in access to attention is pretty self-explanatory. A student might continuously tap on the table with their pencil during morning work, hoping to get the teacher's attention. An example of access to tangibles is a student who whines or complains for a preferred activity or like another piece of candy. If the teacher allows it after already saying no, the student learns that that behavior of whining is effective. Access to escape is elopement. Students try to escape boring tasks, negative consequences, physical demands, or non-preferred activity or people. And examples of sensory-seeking behavior are cracking knuckles or clapping hands, or most commonly fidgeting. So it's important to note that these behaviors that I gave an example for could be caused by a number of factors in the environment, and that's why collecting data on the behavior is important so you can identify the correct trigger and know like which motivation it is. So using ABA in the classroom. So we actually use ABA all the time through PBIS, or the Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports. We reviewed this last week, but it's identifying a challenging behavior, deciding on an intervention, and tracking the data to see how it works. Interventions can include giving choices, more structured routine, or teaching relationship skills. The intent of PBIS is not just a coin system that most schools have right now implement. So some other ABA strategies is that we learn how to determine the motivation, and that is done by keeping track of data. Because it's also easy to think, oh, if they're disrespecting me, they don't like me. But ABA says, let's look deeper into that about the environment and what is causing the student to be disrespectful. It's also really important to be consistent in ABA and have the same intervention used on the same reinforcement consequence, kind of interchangeable wording. And then lastly, I chose this quote because hopefully I kind of sound like a broken record that data is the key to ABA. You decide on an intervention and then you use that intervention and track it. And then if it works, that's great. If it doesn't, that's okay. You can use different interventions or you can test several interventions at the same time. And then something we've also addressed in class in week 2 was the ABC observation. Here's a couple different charts. So the ABC chart is the antecedent behavior and consequence. You're saying what happened to provoke a behavior, what was the actual specific behavior, and then what was the consequence, positive or negative? What did the student get out of that behavior? Schools use different charts. Some are already pre-filled out, so you just check what it is, and then some let you fill it out and write in what you saw. So, concluding, I love this quote that if they can't learn the way we teach the way they learn. Other than data and behaviors and consequences, applied behavioral analysis is about changing our behavior as educators to best support students. If most students, like for example, if most students don't understand an academic lesson we taught, we go back to the drawing board and teach a different way. We know that students learn best through various modalities and learning styles, and the same principles apply to behavior. ABA gives us a framework to understand and modify behavior by changing the student's environment, but by also changing what we do and how we respond and what consequences we give, so that we can change the student's behavior and create a safer and more conducive learning environment for all the students. So here are my resources. If you'd like to look into some more information, the PBIS website was super helpful because it helps you track like what is the behavior, and then it gives you possible interventions that you can try. So thank you so much. And please let me know if you have any questions. Thanks.